What if the love you carry as a symbol of purity and freedom were actually just another carefully disguised prison? Nietzsche distrusted everything that seemed too sacred, too beautiful, too elevated. For him, the love we know isn't a spontaneous impulse of life, but a moral construction forged to domesticate our instincts and make us obey ideals that don't spring from ourselves. It's harsh to think about this, because we've learned from early age to believe that loving equals virtue, completeness, meaning. But what if, behind this promise, there were only invisible chains? Chains made of expectations, dependency, sacrifices imposed as if they were noble. Nietzsche didn't want to destroy love, but to reveal its abysses. He wanted to free us from illusions, so we could love not out of obligation, but as life's affirmation. And this question keeps echoing. Is the love you live truly yours, or just a repetition of moral codes that imprison you? When we think about love, we usually associate it with something natural, instinctive, that springs from within like a vital necessity. However, for Nietzsche, much of what we call love is less an authentic impulse and more an invention shaped by morality, especially by the Judeo-Christian tradition. This tradition transformed desire, which originally is force, instinct, life, into something that should be controlled, moderated, and even guilt-ridden. Love, in this sense, isn't just a feeling, but a tool, a cultural construction used to domesticate bodies and wills. Society has always known there's nothing more powerful than human desire. It moves people, revolutions, sacrifices. For this very reason, religions and moral systems took care to capture it and give it an acceptable form. They created the idea of pure love, faithful love, sacrificial love. And suddenly, what was merely life's impulse became entangled by norms. Those who love must renounce themselves, must place the other above everything, must sacrifice in the name of supposed spiritual greatness. Love was transformed into an instrument of discipline. Nietzsche viewed this with suspicion. For him, every time an instinct is moralized, something of human vitality is lost. The desire for union, pleasure and sharing was captured and converted into a form of control. Loving stopped being an expression of strength and became a domestication mechanism. Think about how many times the idea of love comes accompanied by commandments. Don't desire others, don't abandon, don't question, don't break. Loving became obeying an invisible code, not simply living an affection. An everyday example helps perceive this trap. Imagine someone who remains in a relationship even when unhappy, because they believe true love demands sacrifice. This person isn't being guided by life's instinct, but by the weight of a morality that defines what's right or wrong in loving. Love here functions as prison. It traps the individual in a role, in an expectation, in a form of virtue that doesn't correspond to their power. They don't remain because they want to, but because they must. Nietzsche saw in Christian morality a perverse ability to transform human forces into golden chains. Love became one of these chains. Instead of being creative experience, it became obedience. The love thy neighbor as thyself is, for Nietzsche, one of the greatest mechanisms of leveling, of erasing individuality. Loving, in this mold, isn't self-affirmation, but self-annulment before the other. It's living according to an ideal that doesn't spring from within, but is imposed as a rule of virtue. But what if love were something else? What if, stripped of morality, it were just an encounter between forces, a life overflow without need for justifications? Nietzsche believed that life's instinct, when not imprisoned by morality, could express itself in richer and freer ways. The problem isn't love itself, but domesticated love, institutionalized, transformed into dogma. This love fabricated by morality is the one that teaches us that loving is suffering, that loving is sacrificing, that loving is obeying. By revealing this moral origin, Nietzsche invites us to distrust what we call love. Is what we feel really ours? Or is it a repetition of inherited values, a ready script in which we merely act? This question is disturbing because it challenges not only our relationships, but also our identity. If love is morality's invention, how many of our effective choices are truly free? Nietzsche doesn't give us easy answers, but pushes us toward the discomfort of lucidity. He dismantles the altar of idealized love and shows us what lies behind it. A history of control, moralization, and denial of instincts. Only by perceiving this can we open space for another way of loving, less servile and more vital. Deep down, the question is, do you love because you feel or because you believe you should? Nietzsche always alerts us to something fundamental. Where there's life, there's will to power. This means there's no neutrality in our impulses, and love, far from being an exception, is perhaps one of the most intense fields of this dispute. When we say we love someone, we often think of something pure, altruistic, disinterested. But for Nietzsche, this vision is illusory. Behind love pulses a game of forces, the desire to possess, to mark territory, to affirm oneself over the other. Think about how, in daily life, people talk about love. You are mine, I am yours, I can't live without you. These expressions, so common and even seen as romantic, reveal a core of appropriation. Love here isn't free encounter, but a possession relationship. It's desire disguised as affection, seeking to trap the other under its rules. Nietzsche saw in this type of language the mask of power, the attempt to dominate under the pretext of loving. This doesn't mean love is just conscious manipulation. It's not about imagining couples secretly plotting control over each other. The point is deeper. Desire's very nature is active, expansive, and always seeks to impose itself. Desire is never passive. It invades, transforms, shapes. When this desire is channeled into what we call love, it inevitably becomes a field of tensions. We love, but at the same time we want to be loved back. We want reciprocity, fidelity, security, and if we don't receive this, we feel anger, jealousy, resentment. There's no innocence in this game. Nietzsche saw love's morality as a way to disguise this game of forces. The idea of pure love, free of interests, emerges precisely to hide what it really is: a field of power. When someone says, "I love you unconditionally," often what's at stake is a hidden expectation, an attempt to guarantee control through bonding. It's as if the person said, "I'm offering you everything, so you must offer me the same." Power disguises itself as generosity. A common example helps see this dynamic. Imagine a couple where one person always gives in, always makes concessions, always sacrifices in love's name. At first sight, it seems they're being altruistic. But behind this behavior, there's often an attempt to acquire moral power over the other. It's as if they said, "I suffer for you, therefore you owe me fidelity, gratitude, and obedience." Love transforms into exchange currency, into subtle blackmail. This is the game Nietzsche exposes. Even in renunciation, there's domination. But the most disturbing aspect is perceiving how desire itself is already a force of appropriation. When we desire someone, we want not only to share moments, but also to shape, influence, occupy a space in that person's life. We want exclusivity. We want centrality. Jealousy isn't accidental, but natural consequence of desire's logic. For Nietzsche, love isn't harmonious union, but battlefield where each seeks, consciously or not, to impose their way of existing. However, this doesn't mean love is false or useless. On the contrary, Nietzsche believed love could be one of life's most intense expressions. The problem is, when we pretend it's only sweetness and surrender, when we forget that behind it there's struggle, hierarchy, dispute. Only by recognizing this dimension of power can we love more lucidly, without illusions. Loving in this sense isn't losing oneself in the other, but assuming that every encounter is confrontation. Confrontation of desires, forces, worlds trying to interpenetrate. Love isn't the negation of conflict, but the space where it happens most intimately. In this clash resides its beauty and its pain. Thus, the question Nietzsche leaves us is uncomfortable. When you say "I love," what do you really desire? The other in their freedom, or the other molded to your will? Are you loving a real person, or just the version of them that fits your need for power? Romantic love is perhaps one of modernity's most seductive inventions. It emerges as a golden myth, a promise of completeness, an ideal of fusion between two souls that recognize each other as lost halves. It's a powerful narrative, fed by poetry, music, stories, and traditions that repeat generation after generation. But Nietzsche, with his suspicious gaze, would see in this shine a trap. For him, the more beautiful and sublime an ideal presents itself, the greater the chance it's hiding a domestication mechanism. Romantic love, with its aura of purity and absolute surrender, would be precisely one of these invisible prisons. The central myth of romantic love is the idea that there's someone made for us, a soulmate who will give meaning to our life. This promise creates an imaginary of search and waiting, as if we were incomplete until finding the other. Nietzsche would see in this a weakening of the will to power, because it places our realization in alien hands. Instead of affirming ourselves as complete individuals, we remain expecting to be completed by someone. This dependency, disguised as ideal, keeps us in a state of lack, of constant search for an affective savior. And when this special someone appears, romantic love imposes its own rules: absolute fidelity, exclusivity, sacrifice, renunciation. Loving in this model means giving up part of oneself in the relationship's name. How many people believe that love's maximum proof is self-annulment, setting aside personal dreams and desires to dedicate themselves to the other? Nietzsche would call this moralization of affections, capture of vital instinct to serve an ideal that doesn't spring from life, but from a cultural construction that exalts obedience. An everyday example can illustrate this imprisonment. Imagine someone who, upon starting a relationship, feels they need to radically change their behavior to fit their partner's expectations. Maybe cut friendships, abandon hobbies, modify their way of dressing, simply to sustain the perfect couple ideal. At first sight, it seems like proof of love, but in practice, it's self-emptying, a sacrifice in the name of a morality that demands fusion and renunciation. Romantic love, in this sense, functions as a golden cell. You don't immediately perceive the prison because the bars are covered with promises of eternal happiness. Nietzsche distrusted this type of ideal because it levels individuals. If everyone believes in the same model of love, everyone starts living similar relationships shaped by the same expectations. Singularity, which is the mark of each being's power, is diluted in a ready script. People don't live the love they could create, but the love they were told they should live. The soulmate myth is one of the strongest examples of this. It makes us believe we're incomplete by nature and will only find fullness in another being. For Nietzsche, nothing would be more contrary to life. We are whole in our strength, and if we love, it must be as overflow, not as lack. Another important point is how romantic love feeds unrealistic expectations. The idea of eternal love, unchangeable, capable of resisting all difficulties, creates enormous pressure on relationships. When inevitable wear appears, when desire transforms, when differences emerge, the couple faces a sense of failure. But it's not love that failed, it's the myth that proved unsustainable. How many people don't insist on maintaining failed relationships just to sustain the appearance that the ideal is still alive? Nietzsche would see in this another form of resentment, the inability to accept life's impermanence and affections. Romantic love also carries within itself a logic of property. Absolute exclusivity, demanded as proof of love, often transforms into surveillance and control. Jealousy is romanticized as a sign of care, when it actually reveals possession anxiety. Nietzsche would perceive in this aspect another symptom of will to power, disguising itself as virtue. Loving in this mold isn't welcoming the other in their difference, but molding them to the image of our insecurities. And there's still the weight of idealization. In romantic love, the other is never just a common human being with flaws and contradictions. They're seen as savior, as destiny, as completeness. This projection inevitably creates frustration because no one can sustain this role forever. When reality emerges with its conflicts and limitations, disappointment is deep. Nietzsche would say this disappointment isn't love's fault itself, but of the lie we invented about it. But most dangerous is that under sweetness's disguise, romantic love corrodes autonomy. It teaches that loving is depending, that happiness only exists as a pair, that solitude is failure. By internalizing these beliefs, many people can no longer imagine a full life outside the love bond. They become hostages of the relationship, incapable of bearing the freedom of being with themselves. And thus, love, which could be an expression of power, converts into invisible prison. Nietzsche invites us to suspect this trap. He doesn't reject love, but refuses the romantic illusion that transforms it into morality disguised as destiny. His proposal is to free affection from idealization's chains, so we can love not as those seeking completeness, but as those overflowing with life. Love not to annul oneself, but to affirm oneself alongside the other. Love without myths, without chains, without fear of impermanence. And here remains the provocation. Is the love you live the fruit of your singular creation, or just the repetition of a romantic script they taught you since childhood? Among all the concepts Nietzsche elaborated, perhaps none is as revealing for understanding love as resentment. For him, resentment is the mark of a soul that cannot affirm life as it is, and that instead builds narratives, accusations, and guilt to bear its own impotence. In love's field, resentment appears subtly but devastatingly. It's the sweet poison that transforms relationships into prisons, that covers desire with moral masks, and that feeds affective dependency as if it were virtue. Resentment arises when we cannot express our will to power in creative ways. Instead of transforming the world, we seek culprits. Instead of acting, we ruminate offenses. Instead of affirming, we fixate on what we lack. Love, when captured by morality, becomes fertile ground for this. How many times do we see relationships where love confuses itself with subtle charges, emotional blackmail, and accumulated guilt? Resentment creates an invisible bond. It binds lovers not by life's force but by debt fear, the weight of unfulfilled promises. A simple example can show this mechanism. Imagine someone who always reminds their partner of all the sacrifices they made in the relationship's name. I abandon my dreams for you. Therefore, you owe me absolute fidelity. This charge doesn't spring from power, but from weakness. It's resentment in action, transforming one's own sacrifice into control currency, into moral weapon against the other. Love here stops being encounter and becomes tribunal, where each gesture is measured, where each debt must be paid. Nietzsche saw in Christian morality the source of this poisoning, the glorification of sacrifice, renunciation, suffering for love. This ideal teaches that true loving is renouncing oneself, and by renouncing, the person accumulates moral credits that later charges from the other, Affective dependency is born in this terrain. It's not just about wanting the other, but becoming incapable of existing without them. Love becomes a silent contract of emotional exchanges, where each side tries to guarantee security through guilt. Affective dependency is, in this sense, resentment's legitimate child. Those who depend on the other to exist don't really love, they cling. And those who cling always charge, always fear losing, always watch. Jealousy, possessiveness, chronic insecurity, all this reveals the deep fear of being alone, the terror of facing one's own incompleteness. Nietzsche would see in this a sign of weakness. It's not life overflowing in encounter, but life leaning on the other as a crutch. Resentment also transforms love into a field of revenge. How many times doesn't someone forgive an offense just to use it later as a weapon? How many times aren't a betrayal, a failure, or an oversight kept as ammunition, ready to be fired in the next argument? This type of behavior doesn't seek to resolve, but perpetuate the wound, because in it lies the source of power. Nietzsche would say this is the morality of the weak. Not having how to impose themselves through creative force, they seek to dominate through accumulation of debts and guilt. But perhaps resentment's cruelest aspect in love is how it disguises itself as virtue. The resentful person doesn't see themselves as weak, but as just, moral, faithful to the ideal. They say, "I only suffer because I love too much," or "my jealousy is proof of my surrender." Actually, these statements hide an attempt to imprison the other in dependency's web. Love, which could be a space of freedom, becomes a theater of guilt and justifications. Nietzsche challenges us to look at this without masks. He would tell us, where there's resentment, there's no true love, but only the moral disguise of a lack. Loving, when born from power, doesn't charge, doesn't watch, doesn't demand fusion. Loving, in this other sense, is letting the other be, is rejoicing in difference, is creating together without one needing to annul the other. However, this vision is difficult to sustain because we were educated to believe that dependency is care, that jealousy is passion, that sacrifice is proof of love. It takes courage to perceive how much resentment we carry in relationships. How many times do we use love as excuse to control, to watch, to keep someone tied to us? How many times do we confuse attachment with affection, fear with surrender, possessiveness with passion? Nietzsche invites us to invert this logic. Instead of loving for lack, love for excess. Instead of charging, create. Instead of leaning on the other as crutch, walk alongside as power. Resentment and affective dependency aren't destiny, but choices disguised as virtue. Only by recognizing this can we free love from its moral prison. And the question that remains is this: is the love you live really life's affirmation, or just resentment disguised as care? Nietzsche didn't limit himself to destroying romantic love's idols or morality's prisons. His philosophy, contrary to what many believe, isn't just demolition, it's also creation. After exposing the invisible chains that shape what we call love, he offers an alternative path: amor fati. Translated as love of fate, this notion isn't just accepting what happens, but affirming with intensity each instant of life, as if we wanted to repeat it eternally. When applied to love, amor fati invites us to love without illusions, without idealizations, without prisons, but as a gesture of radical affirmation of existence. Loving fate doesn't mean resigning to any situation, like those who passively endure the inevitable. It means, on the contrary, embracing life in all its intensity, its joys, pains, encounters, and farewells. In the love field, this implies accepting that the other is free, that desire is changeable, that impermanence is part of life. Amor fati breaks with the logic of forever and with the search for the half that would complete us. It teaches us to live love as present experience, as overflow of what we are, without needing to guarantee or control the future. Think about how many times we suffer not for what love is, but for what we'd like it to be. We suffer because the other doesn't correspond exactly to our expectations, because the relationship doesn't follow romantic love's script, because time transforms desire. By resisting this, we fill ourselves with resentment, charges, pain. Amor fati, on the contrary, invites us to say yes, even to the unexpected, even to change. Loving fate is loving the other not as ideal, but as living reality, with flaws, contradictions, and limits. Nietzsche believed this type of love is only possible from strength. Only those who feel whole can love without losing themselves. Those living in lack seek in the other the completeness they don't find in themselves. But those who affirm themselves, who accept destiny and reconcile with their own solitude, can love in another way, not by necessity, but by abundance. Loving, then, isn't leaning but sharing, isn't annulling oneself but expanding. An example can make this idea more concrete. Imagine two people who meet and live a relationship. Instead of demanding guarantees of eternal fidelity or promising endless sacrifices, they decide to live love as joint creation, knowing it may last months, years, or a lifetime, but without the need to control this time. Each encounter is lived as if unique as life's affirmation in that instant. If love ends, it won't be seen as failure, but as part of existence's flow. This is Amor fati's logic. Nothing is lost when life is affirmed in its totality. Of course, this sounds challenging. We're so accustomed to romantic love's chains that thinking about love without absolute promises seems even threatening. But Nietzsche didn't seek to comfort us. He wanted to awaken us. And awakening, in this case, means abandoning control illusions and embracing life in its instability. Amor fati is loving without fear of impermanence, because impermanence is life itself. There's also a profound dimension of freedom in this vision. When we love fate, we don't charge the other to become what we desire. We accept their singularity, their difference, their freedom. The other isn't seen as possession, but as shared destiny. This doesn't eliminate conflicts, but places them in another perspective, not as flaws that ruin the ideal, but as inevitable parts of existence. Nietzsche provokes us to imagine, what if, instead of seeking perfect love, we learned to love the real exactly as it is? What if, instead of suffering from change, we learned to celebrate it as proof that life continues in movement? This is Amor fati's essence. It's not about waiting for love to save us, but using love as space to affirm life in all its forms. This path demands courage. It demands the strength of those capable of looking at life without needing illusions to bear it. It demands the maturity of accepting that the other doesn't belong to us and that happiness doesn't depend on guarantees. But it's precisely there that love becomes freer, more authentic, more creative. Thus, Amor fati isn't just a philosophical alternative. It's an intimate revolution. It challenges us to abandon invisible chains and live love not as prison, but as celebration. Loving fate is loving each encounter, each instant, each transformation, even those that hurt us. And the question Nietzsche leaves echoing is this: are you ready to love not the ideal they invented, but the real destiny that life places before you? We arrive at the final point of this journey, where Nietzsche invites us to look at love no longer as prison, but as possibility of power. After deconstructing romantic love, revealing the resentment that poisons it, and proposing Amor fati as alternative, remains the most radical question. How would it be to love without morality? How would it be to love not as duty, not as sacrifice, not as renunciation, but as expression of creative force? Loving without morality is freeing affection from all chains that transformed it into obedience. It means abandoning the idea that loving is self-annulment, that loving is self-sacrifice, that loving is living for the other. These formulas, so rooted in our culture, are, for Nietzsche, signs of domestication. They transform love into a field of debt and resentment, preventing it from flourishing in its most vital form. Loving without morality, therefore, is returning to love its original force, that of being life's overflow. When a person loves from their power, they don't seek in the other a crutch nor a compliment. They love because they're full, because they have within themselves an abundance they wish to share. Love, in this sense, doesn't spring from lack, but from fullness. Loving is creation, is invention, is encounter between forces that don't annul each other, but multiply. Each relationship is seen not as prison, but as work of art built by two, where each preserves their singularity. An example can help clarify this idea. Imagine someone who enters a relationship without the expectation that the other will complete or heal their wounds. Instead of charging, this person offers. Instead of watching, trusts. Instead of demanding guarantees, celebrates each moment as unique. If the relationship lasts long, great. If it ends, it won't be seen as failure, but as part of life's dance. This is love as force, free, creative, affirmative. Nietzsche saw in moralized love an attempt to deny life. Love without morality, on the contrary, is a shout of yes to existence. It doesn't flee from pains, nor from transformations, nor from farewells. It embraces all this as part of experience. Therefore, loving like this demands courage. Courage to live without guarantees. Courage to accept the other's freedom. Courage not to hide behind romantic illusions. But it's precisely this courage that makes love deeper. Loving as force also means refusing resentment. Those who truly love don't transform sacrifice into exchange currency, don't collect offenses to use as weapons, don't demand the other live according to their insecurity. Loving without morality is leaving behind guilt and debt logic. It's building relationships not on fear of losing, but on joy of sharing. It's looking at the other not as property, but as universe in movement, as free and singular as ourselves. Nietzsche believed only a stronger humanity could love this way. Therefore, his criticism of moralized love is also a call to personal transformation. It's not enough to change the way of loving. It's necessary to change the way of existing. Those living trapped in lack, dependency, and fear will hardly manage to love without morality. But those who affirm life in their solitude, who find power in themselves, can love as those who create, as those who overflow. This is love that doesn't imprison, but expands. Love that doesn't charge, but celebrates. Love that doesn't suffocate, but liberates. It's a love that approaches more a dance than a contract, more a work of art than an institution. It's the love that Nietzsche, with his philosophy of life, invites us to experiment. A love that isn't escape, but affirmation. Not prison, but power. And here we arrive at an inevitable question. Are you willing to abandon the illusions that morality taught you about love? Are you prepared to love not as one who obeys, but as one who creates? This is the Nietzschean challenge. Loving without morality is loving as force, and this perhaps is the greatest act of freedom we can perform. Throughout this journey, we walked with Nietzsche through love's abysses and clarities. We discovered that much of what we call love is actually moral invention, created to domesticate our desires and mold our lives according to ideals that don't spring from us. We saw that desire is always a field of forces, that romantic love hides golden chains, that resentment and dependency corrode relationships, and that, however, there's another path. Amor fati, love as radical acceptance of life. And finally, we arrived at the most transformative possibility, loving without morality, loving as force, loving as creation. Nietzsche didn't want to teach us to destroy love, but to liberate it. He wanted us to stop living love as prison and start living it as life's affirmation. Love, when born from fullness and not from lack, can be celebration, dance, singular invention between two worlds that meet. And now the question is yours. Which belief about love has most imprisoned you until today? Share your thoughts in the comments and tell us from which city you're watching us. If this journey resonated with you, like this video and subscribe to the channel. We're building a community that seeks to think deeper and live more consciously.